Shannon Pettypiece is a White House correspondent for Bloomberg, joins us now. So President Trump called this a miracle for the middle class, but his own economic advisor won't guarantee that taxes won't go up. I want to play you a bite.
Who is your tax plan intended to help?
Really the working people. We say the working people, middle class, the people that really haven't been treated right.
There will be middle class families who get a tax increase under your plan, correct?
George, there's an exception to every rule.
So that's a yes.
So look, I can't guarantee anything. You can always find a unique family somewhere.
You can always find a unique family somewhere. Shannon, what are the dangers of making promises at this point in the game?
Well, one of the dangers is we don't have many of the details of the plan yet. We have a rough outline. We have a lot of goals and a lot of hopes that they can achieve, but we don't know if they're going to be able to achieve them because there's a big battle ahead of them in Congress to get this through. Part of the question here about who benefits from it, there's been criticism already that the rich would clearly benefit from it based on what we know right now by the elimination of the estate tax and the elimination of the AMT, which a lot of upper income earners pay. How much it benefits the middle class is still unknown because we don't know the income levels that fall into these new tax brackets. So a lot of questions that still need to be answered here.
And we also don't know where the money's coming from, who's making up for these cuts. The White House says that the tax cuts will be paid for with growth. I want to play you a bite from Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin from CBS This Morning.
What happens if you don't have the economic growth?
Charlie, I think, we're very comfortable. The president's #1 focus is creating economic growth, and that's a combination of tax reform, regulatory relief, and trade. And we're very comfortable we're going to get to 3% GDP, which creates over $2 trillion of revenues and $10 trillion of economic growth.
So the $1 trillion of revenue, is there evidence to back up their claim?
Well, I've heard this referred to as a lot of candy and not many vegetables. You need to pay for this somehow, and paying for this by growth there's not enough people confident in that. So sure, maybe it looks like you can get 3% growth now, but what happens when something happens outside of your control? Oh, let's say a couple hurricanes or a recession or a bubble burst. So just counting on growth isn't going to be enough for a lot of people. Typically, when you do tax cuts, there's some sort of cut to spending, just like a person would to their own household income. If their income coming in changed, they'd cut back on spending. There's been no talk about entitlement reform, not even a whiff of talk. So that's part of this battle that's ahead that we're going to see play out on the Hill.
So Shannon, how is the White House working with GOP lawmakers to try and move this forward?
Well, they've spent months. I mean, the entire summer they've been spending trying to build a coalition, much more so than we saw in the health care fight. But this poses to be an even bigger fight than health care because you see tax reform break down under different sort of ideological lines. For example, we've already seen Republicans from New York and New Jersey come out against this because this would raise taxes for people in those states because it gets rid of a tax credit in these high tax states. So they've spent a lot of time. They're doing what they can. But there's a reason we haven't had tax reform since the 80s. It's hard to get a group of people to come together on it. Just because it's hard doesn't mean they shouldn't try, but it also means they shouldn't be counting on it happening necessarily by the end of the year.
You mentioned trying to get people together. I was kind of surprised when we saw the president on Air Force One with Senator Joe Donnelly of Indiana when he went over to talk in Indianapolis about this tax plan. He's trying to reach out to Democrats, and this was a Democrat in a state that is very vulnerable. He won handily. What are Republicans saying about his efforts to try and court some of these Democrats?
Well, Republicans who want this passed acknowledge they're probably going to need Democratic support. As we saw, again, with health care, you can't necessarily count on the party being united here. So as they lose people in, let's say, those high-income states or those high-tax states, like I mentioned, or they lose people who are real fiscal conservatives who want to see entitlement cuts as part of this, they realize they are going to need Democrats to come on board. I was with the president when he went to North Dakota earlier this month to try and woo over the senator from North Dakota to come on board. So I expect to see a lot more bipartisan outreach here, certainly, than we saw in health care.
Do you think that people are agreeing with this strategy? He's reached out to, as you mentioned, we've seen this before where he's reached out, gone to states and included the Democratic senator or members of Congress with him. Is this what the White House is all part of an effort to reach out and get legislation passed with Democrats?
Yeah, and we saw that momentum earlier this month with the whole Chuck and Nancy meeting and the president showing that, I don't just have to be stuck with Paul and Mitch. I can throw in a third party to negotiate here, too. I don't know how long this will go on. And when comments are made like the NFL over the weekend, you get Democrats and the Democratic base riled up, and that makes it even more difficult. But if they can keep the tone civil and keep the temperature down, then maybe it is possible you can pick off certain Democrats in certain states, depending also on on their own political demographics in those states.
Shannon Pettypiece from the White House. Thank you for joining us, Shannon.